Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin, and this is Life, Liberty, and Levin on Sunday. Welcome back. Those of you who watch Saturday, we appreciate it. Same place, same time, completely different show. I want to thank you for watching tonight. I consider this a very, very important program. I've spent 16 months researching and writing this book, The Democrat Party Hates America. Sounds pretty provocative, but once you hear what I have to say, and once you read the book, you'll realize I'm not provocative, they're provocative. We have a lot of problems in this country, and for the most part, they can rest at the feet of the Democrat Party. Why do I say that? Well, what is the Democrat Party? Is it a political party? It's more than a political party. The Republican Party is a political party. It is in many ways an ineffective political party. When people go to vote and they vote Republican, most of the time they don't know why they're voting Republican, and the Republican Party doesn't tell them why they should vote for them. I call these people who run the Republican Party, Republican establishment, or rhinos, or what have you, because they reject fundamental constitutional conservative principles. Or they might say they support them, but they do nothing to uphold them. The Democrat Party seeks to put Donald Trump in prison for the rest of his life. Meanwhile, the Republicans are debating whether or not they should even have an impeachment inquiry of the most corrupt president in American history. Think about that. Well, that's not the purpose of this book, and it's not the purpose of this show. I want to break down for you what is a very comprehensive, substantive, detailed explanation of why the Democrat Party is actually a very evil entity that has caused a lot of mayhem and worse in this country from its very founding. That is the founding of the Democrat Party. And so it becomes difficult, if not complicated, to convey accurately or even persuasively what's in the book. I will do my best. But the case is overwhelming. And to talk about what's going on in the abstract in this country is not good enough anymore. Who is responsible for what's taking place in this country today? It is the Democrat Party. The Democrat Party has never accepted Americanism. When we think of the Civil War, we think of the war between the North and the South, the war against slavery versus those who were defending slavery, but it was also a war between the new Republican Party and the Democrat Party. Abraham Lincoln representing the Republican Party. The Democrat Party was the party of the Confederacy. That's a fact. And since then, it has been the party of anti-Americanism in so many ways. The Democrat Party is the party of anti-Americanism. Now, let me make the case. Authoritarian rule dressed up as democracy. Sound familiar? The state party, that is, there's really no difference between the massive bureaucracy and its agenda and the Democrat Party. Why? Because it is owned and paid for by the Democrat Party. Every time we have a threat of a government shutdown, really the debate is over how powerful do we want the Democrat Party and its bureaucracy to be. Rewriting history for political purposes. This is what totalitarian parties do, and fascist regimes and Marxist regimes, and this is what we're doing in America. Who's pushing it? The Democrat Party and their teachers' unions. They trash the Declaration of Independence, they trash the Constitution, they trash the American founding, they trash our economic system, all under the umbrella of the Democrat Party. I'll put you to the test. How many leaders of the Democrat Party have rejected CRT? None. How many have rejected this attack on the Founding Fathers? None. How many have rejected the 1619 Project? None. They all promote it, and there's a reason for it. Changing election procedures to advantage the party, but give the impression of a free and fair election. We saw all throughout the pandemic. No, it was leading up to it, but all throughout the pandemic, blue and purple states changed their election procedures. Why did they change their election procedures? Oh, to allow more people to vote. The issue isn't whether you allow more people to vote. The issue is whether you allow more people who have a right to vote. And you need security measures in place, like voter ID, eliminated in several states, like signed absentee ballots, eliminated in many of these states. You need to prevent things like voter harvesting, counting votes after an election, That's a big one the Democrat Party pushes. They pushed H.R. 1 to nationalize the election procedures. Why? To destroy the ability of the Republican Party to win elections. They basically took the election procedures in California and they wanted to put them throughout the nation. They opposed the Electoral College. Why? Because they want the Democrat strongholds, the more populated areas, to control the country, eliminating representative government for half the country. They want to control the language and thought processes. What's a woman? Oh, I don't know. What's a man? Oh, I can't say. Oh, pronouns. Okay. Born with a certain type of genitalia? Because language has an effect on action. Well, you know, we can change that. We can fix that. They're in the business of censorship, of attacking free speech in the First Amendment. Why? Language manipulation and thought control. That's what totalitarian, autocratic parties demand. That's what the Democrat Party demands. And the Democrat Party, like any other autocratic party, needs what? A state-run media. State-run party needs state-run media. Now, why do I call the Democrat Party the state-run party? As I said, the bureaucracy exists not for the American people, but to advance the cause and the agenda and the ideology of the Democrat Party. And they need their state-run media to do the same thing. We don't have a free press. We have a press that's free to lie to us, that's free to advance this agenda. That's what we have. The legalization of repression. Well, you can see that. You can see that with parents. You can see that with the Catholic Church. You can see that with pro-lifers. You can certainly see that with Donald Trump. The idea that you would indict a former president not once, but 91 times, up to 1,000 years in prison, this was unheard of up to a few years ago. And no, it's not because of Trump. It's because of the regime that's in the executive branch and because of the Democrat Party. There are no longer any red lines it won't cross. Create intimidation. Create intimidation. The January 6th protesters, who were not violent, who were not rioters, many hundreds of them, the book has been thrown at them. Create intimidation. Create enemies of the people. Enemies of the people. Who are the enemies of the people? MAGA. MAGA is enemies of the people, but not just them. The justices on the Supreme Court who aren't radical leftists, they're the enemy of the people. The founders were the enemy of the people, and so forth. The destruction of the nuclear family. This is crucial, according to Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto. Well, what do you think is taking place today? The destruction of the nuclear family. In fact, parents have no rights when it comes to children if you listen to the Democrat Party and your union thugs, which is you even have bureaucrats, that's what they are, in these government facilities, government schools, saying that they will decide, without parent input, if a child's genitalia should be changed, surgically or chemically. Think about that. The destruction of traditions and customs in the civil society, the capture of our cultural institutions, our educational institutions, our political institutions, the destruction of capitalism. Capitalism equals freedom. Capitalism equals individuality, success. Capitalism underscores the prosperity that a free nation can achieve. Well, they're constantly attacking capitalism. Hell, one of their great leaders is Bernie Sanders, a Marxist, who rails against capitalism all the time. In the House, you have a score and more Democrats, Marxists, who attack capitalism. You have Hakeem Jeffries, who has spent most of his life, the Democrat leader, attacking what? Capitalism. And of course, you have Joe Biden constantly talking about class warfare, economic warfare. Racism, anti-Semitism, and groupism. The Democrat Party has supported all of them. It supports them all now. It supported them all over 100 years ago. It supported them all at the turn of the last century. I will demonstrate that in a moment. The constant attack on the status quo of the existing society. There is a barrage, day in and day out, trashing individuals, trashing organizations, trashing our history, trashing even the future. And they keep talking about the fundamental transformation of America, not just Obama or his wife Michelle, not just Bernie Sanders, not just Joe Biden. It is constant. Well, what does that mean to fundamentally transform America? Into what? Now, I wrote a prior book called American Marxism, into American Marxist paradise society, which of course can never exist. And so this book makes the case that the Democrat Party today is the monopoly party, that it seeks and is getting monopoly control over the electoral system, that it wants monopoly control over the bureaucracy. It's almost there. And it wants to basically replace the country with the party, or to make them indistinguishable. That's what you have in all these fascistic and Marxist regimes. In fact, the party comes first. In communism, you're the chairman of the party. In fascism, you are the party. In America, you need to be the president or the speaker or the majority leader of the Democrat Party. And have you noticed how they control the agenda all the time? How virtually all the time the Republicans are on defense? And they're on defense in part because they're weak, they're disorganized. But they're also on defense in part because there's an element within the Republican Party that would never have supported Abraham Lincoln for president, that would never have supported Ronald Reagan for president, and many of them did not. And of course, don't support Donald Trump for president. They'd rather see the Democrats win. Or they tell us, with a Donald Trump, the Democrats will win. Well, you can substitute Donald Trump's name for virtually every single conservative that's ever sought the nomination of the Republican Party. Reagan wasn't supported by the Republican establishment. He was undermined every step of the way by, among others, the Bush family. Lincoln got a total of 40% of the popular vote, slightly under. He would not have been president but for the Electoral College. So in part, the Republican Party is, as I said earlier, the default party for most voters. Well, at least they're not the Democrats. You cannot win a majority on a regular basis, and you certainly cannot combat this kind of revolution and this kind of tyrannical party if, in fact, that is how you view things. If you don't put your best foot forward, if you don't explain that it is the Democrat Party that hates America, not some ambiguous concepts, not somebody else, but that this institution hates America, then, I hate to tell you, America, we're in for a very, very difficult time. Now, when we come back, I want to give you some specific examples. In fact, I'm going to go right at what the Democrats believe is the greatest period in American history and the greatest president in American history, Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. Stick with me. Get interesting.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.